Center for Research in Black Culture, and I'm thrilled to greet you all and welcome you to Conversations in Black Freedom Studies virtual edition. Thanks for joining us. And thank you to Joy Horton for live captioning tonight's event for the hearing impaired. We will paste instructions for viewing those captions in the chat window now. The Schomburg Center, a world-renowned institution dedicated to archiving, studying, and interpreting the global Black experience, is celebrating its 95th year. And we have a lot of virtual and digital offerings in store, such as our Black Liberation reading list, events like this one, and much, much more, all of which you can explore by visiting schomburgcenter.org. The Conversations in Black Freedom Studies series is a space to talk about new works in Black social movement history. We're always gathering here to grapple with the past and think about its implications for the present and the future. Perhaps nothing punctures our national sense of progress or exceptionalism as much as the scale and brutality of our systems of incarceration. Tonight, we consider the history of these systems and the resistance against them. To guide us in this, we're so fortunate to have three amazing authors talking about their work. In a moment, we'll introduce Garrett Felber, author of Those Who Know Don't Say, The Nation of Islam, The Black Freedom Movement, and the Carceral State. Kelly Lytle Hernandez, author of City of Inmates, Conquest, Rebellion, and the Rise of Human Caging in Los Angeles, 1771 to 1965. And Carl Suddler, author of Presumed Criminal, Black Youth and the Justice System in Postwar New York. Now, if you haven't already, you can purchase all three of these books at the Schomburg shop, schomburgshop.com, while supplies last. Virtual events, of course, are not the same as gathering in person, but they do create some new opportunities for engagement. So, for example, when we get to the last portion of our agenda tonight, if you want to ask a question of our speakers, you can click on the Q&A menu item, which for most of you will be near the bottom of your Zoom window, and just type your question into the box that pops up. We're also streaming live on YouTube, and we'll take questions there as well. This event is being recorded and will be available for anyone to view after the fact on the Schomburg's live stream and YouTube pages. By default, all of you watching will remain anonymous in that recording. But if we read out your question, or rather so, if we read out your question, we will only mention your first name to preserve your anonymity. This is an important discussion. I'm quite certain we won't get to every question, but we'll do our best. So feel free to type your questions into the Q&A box at any time, and we'll get to them in the last part of tonight's agenda. And now I'd like to bring on stage my co-moderator, Brooklyn College Professor of Political Science, Jean Theo-Harris. Welcome, Jean.
Thank you, Brian. Welcome everyone. It's wonderful to be here. I'm really excited about tonight's conversation and about our season this year. Conversations in Black Freedom Studies is 8 years old. Kamosi Woodard, professor at Sarah Lawrence College, and I started it 8 years ago at the Schomburg, as we saw fewer and fewer places, fewer and fewer bookstores or other public places where people could come and gather and hear new work in Black history and discuss it and think about it. And it really fit with a kind of long-standing mission the Schomburg had always had to be that kind of space. And so this is our 8th year. And we're so grateful to be back in this new, well, I guess it's not so new, online incarnation, which means that people around the country can join us. So that's so wonderful. We are here the first Thursday of every month during the school year at 6:30 Eastern. We're never here in January because it's too close to New Year's. But we are back February 4th. We're going to be talking about civil rights movement legacies. We're going to be talking about and honoring the legacies of Gwen Patton, of Julian Bond, of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. And we'll be joined by Ashley Farmer, Pam Horowitz, and Peniel Joseph. So that's Thursday, February 4th. But tonight, in an extraordinarily timely conversation, we have three scholars. joining us to have a conversation both about kind of the long histories and regimes of policing and incarceration in this country, and the long, long history of struggle and resistance and movement building. We are so glad to have first Garrett Felber, who is an assistant professor of history at the University of Mississippi and a former scholar in residence at the Schomburg Center. Second, we have Kelly Lytle Hernandez, who is a professor of history, African American studies, and urban planning at the University of California, Los Angeles, where she holds the Thomas E. Lifka Endowed Chair in History. And finally, we have Carl Suddler, who is an assistant professor of history at Emory University. Thank you all for being here tonight. So instead of formal presentations like we do at the Schomburg, we're going to have a conversation. And we wanted to begin in many ways where you all began. And so I would like to ask each of you in turn a little bit of your background. How did you get to writing this history of criminal injustice, policing, and organizing? How did you get started? What motivates your research and writing? And Garrett, why don't we start with you?
Okay, well, thank you so much, first of all, for the invite, Jean and Brian. It's a pleasure to be part of such an amazing series that you all have put together, and also to be with such esteemed colleagues like Carl and Kelly. So this project started for me, I think maybe a little bit differently than for a lot of people. It was really sort of historiographical questions that led to political questions for me. So I was working with Manning Marable at Columbia on his biography of Malcolm X, A Life of Reinvention, and just in the archive as a young researcher, finding evidence of a very political organization, especially within sites like prisons and around police brutality. So the question to me was just sort of, where was that in the histories of the Black freedom struggle? Because often there's this kind of exceptionalist narrative where Malcolm holds this esteemed place, and then the Nation of Islam is somehow writ large kind of written out of that. And to the question of what motivates me, it was really through kind of doing the research around organizing in prisons that led me to teach inside. And that began this whole journey of abolitionist organizing, of thinking about, how subjugated knowledge is withheld from people who create that knowledge, whose struggles reflect that knowledge. And actually, just when I was thinking this week about this conversation and this question of what motivates you, I got a letter from someone inside who had read the book. And he said, thank you for, giving me the history that I am living. And that stuck with me in terms of thinking about, providing histories to explain people's situations and give them a sense of the long tradition of resistance that they stand in.
Thank you. Kelly, how about you?
Of course. Well, let me begin by saying how grateful I am to be here tonight, to be in conversation with everyone. I think this is my first event with the Schomburg, and I have to say that I have an incredible debt of gratitude to the New York Public Library System. You may not know this, but in fact, my grandfather was a caretaker of one of the libraries, and it's there that my family lived inside the library, and where our family really affirmed our great love of books and of politics. So it's really wonderful to be here with you all today. So for me personally, I grew up on the US-Mexico border. So I'm a Black child who came of age in the US-Mexico borderlands at a time when there was a war on immigrants and a war on drugs that was really ravaging our communities, where what I call the boys in green, that's the Border Patrol, was snatching away people who were Latinx and brown, while the boys in blue, the San Diego Police Department and the sheriffs, were snatching away young folks like myself through the war on drugs. And really, it was coming up in the border region and seeing the ways in which racial violence and the violence of the state was impacting our communities. I wanted to investigate that. I wanted to figure out what was the connection between these stories. No one was talking about them together in any way. And I've spent the last 20 years of my life, of my career, trying to figure out what are the intersections of policing non-white immigrants with the policing of Black folks and Indigenous folks as well.
Thank you. And Carl?
Yeah, no, and just to also my co-panelists, thank you to both Brian and Jean for organizing this, and to the Schomburg, right, for continuing to be a pillar in the work that so many of us do. I came to this subject, and I'm sure my co-panelists can attest to this. It's been interesting the past 2 years, especially, to see these types of works be designated as timely, and unquestionably it's been. But and I write a little bit about this in the afterword, about the personal experience about writing in this moment, really since and I think I think it's important for all of us to identify sort of that moment forward, that 2012 moment, which seems like it was yesterday, but it was 8 years ago, which have been so formidable in so much of the work that we've been doing. But for me, like, what digging into history allowed me to really realize was that, this work is timely regardless on when we started it, right? It would have been a timely book in 1930s, it would have been a timely book in the 40s, et cetera. And so, my inkling is that timeliness has always been there. And, how I came to this subject really started well before graduate school, before college. And shout out to NYU Press for giving me a little bit of space to talk about this as well in the book, because I do try to get a little personal. But I was a freshman in high school when I saw the movie The Hurricane, right, starring Denzel Washington. And, he plays Reuben Carter, who was a wrongfully convicted middleweight boxer for murder in 1967. And looking back at it now, it wasn't a perfect film, but I just remember being floored by it. And I saw it on a Friday night, and I was in the library the next day, and I checked out the autobiography, and I couldn't put it down. And I go to school at that, to start the next week. I'm in my homeroom with my history teacher, and he asked what I did, and I told him. And I just remember this conversation vividly, and it's one of the kind of formidable moments in sort of my intellectual trajectory, where Mr. Bat, and we called him Coach Bat because I went to one of those high schools where most social studies teachers were coaches of some sport. So Coach Bat was just like, well, how do you know this man was innocent? And my 14-year-old naive self was like, well, it's in a book, and it's not a fiction book. And he followed up with, well, who wrote the book? And I was just like, he did. And then he hits me with do you think that the Hurricane would have written a book from prison declaring himself to be guilty? Or is he more likely to have written a story to prove his innocence? And it just hit me, and it stuck with me ever since, right? In that moment, whether Coach Bat realized it or not, inspired me to think of ways to challenge presumptions of innocence, presumptions of guilt. And it really sent me on this like longer journey that sparked the ideas and the questions and the stories that gave rise to this book. And so, with that, I'm doing this work because I've spent the better part of 20 years of my life since my freshman year of high school being cognizant and aware about what it was like to navigate a world in which those who control the narrative are able to give voice to so many who are presumed criminal.
Thank you. And absolutely, one of the things my friends and I often joke around about my work on Rosa Parks is both it's ever timely and it's evergreen, right? And that, like, I think absolutely that, like, in some sense, we could be sitting here 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 2 years ago, and this conversation would be so very timely. So now we're at the kind of part of the program where you're going to teach us some things. And again, we're doing this as a conversation because it's Zoom and it's easier to sort of focus that way. But I think where I want to begin, all of you talk in detail in your books about the kind of shifting and expanding regimes of policing incarceration and the discourses that arise to justify those regimes, and also the long history of resistance. And we're going to get to that. But where I wanted to start was for each of you to give us an instance, a kind of crucial instance about those regimes, a moment when it changes, when it expands, that we might not fully understand. And Kelly, let's start with you.
Okay. So I think that I'm going to talk about two quick incidents where we see the massive expansion of criminalization and policing that I've written about. So my first book, Migra, A History of the U.S. Border Patrol, is actually about the racialization of immigration law enforcement and of the work of the U.S. Border Patrol. And I think this is an important incident for us to speak about because of the ways in which the regime of effectively criminalizing, apprehending, detaining, and punishing, i.e. deporting immigrants, non-white immigrants, disproportionately Black folks and brown folks, is often not regarded as part of the criminal justice system. And that goes back to a set of decisions that were made by the United States Supreme Court in the late 19th century around the exclusion of Chinese immigrants in particular, that defined entering the United States or being within the United States without documentation as not a crime. And once that was defined as not a crime, that meant that the US Constitution, the Bill of Rights did not cover that area and regime of policing. So people who are apprehended for immigration charges don't have the regarded protections of the Bill of Rights. This is a moment where we see an expansion of criminalization, policing, and punishment that often isn't seen as part of that. So once we include immigration control into the carceral state, it actually becomes, it mushrooms, because much, much larger than we are traditionally accustomed to thinking about it. So millions more people included, and another dynamic of punishment at play. So that's one thing that I would add. The second thing that I would add is the investigations that I did for my second book, City of Inmates, which is a focus on the rise of mass incarceration from the perspective of Los Angeles across the longue durée. That's a book that I began really thinking that I was going to consistently and steadfastly return to African-American history across the whole breadth of that story, that from at least the mid-19th century into the present moment, there would be this violent, brutal, disproportionate focus on policing Black folks. And the thing that I found that was most interesting in the archive is that the policing of Black folks did not begin until the rise of Black LA, right? So as long as our population was small, as long as our population was not concentrated and a threat to the white settler city, we really were not aggressively policed. It was only with the rise of South Central, with the formation of those invisible walls of steel, that we got the arrival of the LAPD and the LA Sheriff's Department that came with the same force and brutality that we see across the country. So these are two different analyses that I have made into racialization, criminalization, and policing, and the ways in which they balloon around racialized populations.
Great. Carl, how about you going next?
Yeah. No, I think a lot about this question, right? And one thing I tried to do in my book was really start to look at systems that contribute to kind of the criminalization process that aren't necessarily confined or thought of as sort of traditional legal system, forces, right? And so one of the things that I talk a lot about is media, right? And print media, and how print media can drive much of the discourse and how we respond and react. And what I've been finding interesting over the last, I guess, the book's been out, 18 months-ish now, is that I learned as much about the book from people who read it and thinking about what sticks with them as much as what, because, I had a student tell me recently that I really appreciate the way you paired stories of lesser known historical actors and events with more well-known historical actors and events, but stories of those well-known people that we don't know, right? And so I shared something with Black Perspectives on Sammy Davis Jr., but another instance in which I do something like that is I opened a book with David Campanella, who is the son of Brooklyn Dodgers catcher Roy. And so David Campanella, and his story here kind of allows multiple lenses into what I tried to do with the book. But David Campanella has a few run-ins with the police early on in life. He was 15 years old where he gets into this like major fist fight at a bowling alley parking lot in Queens. There were no weapons involved, nobody got injured, but he was one of 14 involved in a fist fight who were all taken down to the precinct. All of them were released except for David. And David was transferred from the Flushing precinct to the Bronx Youth House, right? He wasn't paroled to his mother at time of pickup. And so later it was learned that he had made some damaging admissions to a burglary that happened 1 week prior while he was arrested and detained. And so this comes out much later. This comes out, after a couple days after, once they actually released him to his mother. And at the time, his mother wasn't taking any interviews with reporters or anything like that until she got her son. And then after, he was able to leave the precinct, she told reporters this was going to break her husband, his father's heart. And his father, who everybody knows is Roy Campanella, Brooklyn Dodgers teammate of Jackie Robinson, was also more than that, right? He was a huge proponent of various anti-delinquency programs around the city when the Dodgers were in Brooklyn. And so he tells reporters from the New York Times, for years he had been lecturing at YMCAs, at boys clubs and kid groups about walking this kind of straight and narrow. And he felt that he was kind of making that contribution to solving a serious problem in American life. But like any father, he was forced to kind of re-examine what delinquency meant when he experienced the problem firsthand. And so while the Campanellas understood that what David did was wrong and he shouldn't be doing these things, they also thought much of it was being blown out of proportion because of his status, that is being the son of Roy Campanella. And to a certain degree, they were right, because the New York Times comes out, Turner Catledge in particular, who's the managing editor, and says that, we understand at the Times that we have this rule that we don't publish names of juvenile offenders. But not only did they publish David Campanella's name in the newspaper, they also published his image, right? And as a minor, that was a huge no-no. But, the Times was blunt and adamant that said, we have much less to apologize for if we didn't print his name, because it's not the purpose of newspapers to prevent crime or sell any philosophy to the public, when that's actually what these newspapers were actually doing time and time again. And so David Campanella's story is kind of exacerbated a bit because of his status, but him as sort of this 15-year-old who gets into a little, I don't want to say little fist fight, but who gets into a fist fight and opens up this, spiraling relationship with the legal system is actually quite telling for many of Black youths in the legal system in the mid 20th century. He had a very tense relationship with police officers. He would go on to, he would go on to, a life in the music industry, end up picking up, or ends up, struggling with drug addiction later on in life and dying at a really early age. But the interesting thing around this story and the role of the newspapers and what they were doing to David Campanella in this particular instance, is they were driving so much of the discourse around the behaviors, right? And, so much, they were at what I've tried to do, or will presume criminal really tries to do, is answer this question, right? Why were there so many young people finding themselves ensnared in this legal system? Why was the juvenile justice system becoming so much more punitive than what it had at least appeared to be at the turn of the century? And really, how did it become so expansive and invasive? And what I try to identify is that it becomes that way because there were so many outside factors, right? Media, print media being one of them, that was really influencing how young people were being pushed in and pulled around through the system. Sorry, I noticed I froze a little bit, so my apologies.
No, thank you. And I mean, I think part of what both you and Kelly are doing is sort of expanding even our notion of what constitutes, right, the criminal justice system, to make us look at different aspects of it. And then, of course, that it's not just the criminal justice system, that the media and other players are contributing. Garrett, how about a story or an instance or a moment from your research?
Yeah, I'm glad to go last on this one because I had time to think about it. Actually, so I think the one that I'm going to share, building on what I think Kelly's work does so well, which is show how different populations get criminalized in different moments to different degrees. There was this kind of truism about the Nation of Islam having a presence in prisons that I felt was really under-explained. Like, we understand through Malcolm's autobiography that he converts, during his incarceration, but it was unclear to me still after years of working on Malcolm's life, like, why is the Nation of Islam have this presence in prisons? What does it mean? And through the research, I found that that really during World War II, the Nation of Islam is the largest group of Black conscientious objectors during the war, which I think is really interesting because if we, as historians of the Black freedom struggle, we often talk about the Double V campaign as kind of the dominant strain of protest, right? This kind of appeal to citizenship and service against fascism in return for equal citizenship and an end to racism at home. And then you have this group of 200 Black Muslim men who are saying we're registered with Allah and we're not citizens of the United States. And then to kind of position that group of 200 within this much larger group of conscientious objectors. So there's actually 6,000 people in federal prisons during World War II who are opposing the selective service. And there's this incredible group of organizers in there. I mean, there's this young Baird Rustin and William Worthy and James Peck and Wally Nelson and Roger Axford and David Dellinger. All of these, pacifist civil rights organizers are incarcerated alongside Muslims in the nation. And so what I found was this really interesting sort of constellation of people all incarcerated, all thinking about the relationship of their opposition to war, to racism, and now to prisons. And what does the prison mean to all that? So on one hand, you have people like Rustin and Nelson who are organizing to desegregate the cafeteria in federal prisons. And there's this really remarkable moment where, I don't know how well Wally Nelson is known, but he's this incredible, tax resistor, pacifist organizer, one of the 16 who go on the first freedom ride, the Journey of Reconciliation. And in his journal, he talks really excitedly about this petition that's going around to end racial segregation in the prison cafeteria. And he's excited because a group of Muslim men moved from a table that was, separate. And then he's totally dismayed to find out that they moved because pork was being served, not because of racial segregation. And his interpretation of this is, oh, these are actually segregationists, sort of like a Black KKK. And this whole idea of the Nation of Islam as segregationists, not separationists, and this kind of conflation of those two ideas is really the central way that the Nation of Islam gets marginalized within the civil rights movement by white liberals, by Black liberals, by the media, this whole idea that racial separatism is a form of segregation, and that's what we're against in the civil rights struggle. So I think that story is just really fascinating in terms of thinking about how the nation gets marginalized from the broader Black freedom struggle narratives that we tell, because it really codifies this very specific way that we think about who's in the movement, what the aims of the movement are, what its goals and successes and failures are. And the Nation of Islam is always part of these conversations, part of the organizing. It's just not necessarily in agreement with who we see as the dominant actors. So I think it also speaks to just the ways that different groups are criminalized at different spaces. So they get originally criminalized during World War II for decrying citizenship. but they're not seen as the sort of threat to prisons in 1940 that they are in 1960. So by 1960, they're seen and in the same regards as Rustin in the 40s. So we can also just see the way that the state can kind of change who it criminalizes and the extent to which they repress them over time.
Thank you. And that's a good transition to kind of the next question. That's not going to be surprising, but I want us to turn now to resistance and to kind of an equally long history of resistance. And I think, and I'm sure you have shared my dismay, that I think one of the things about the past 5 years and this amazing kind of upsurge of organizing, but also of like attention to this organizing, is the ways that sometimes it erases that long history. That that obviously Black Lives Matter is a new incarnation of a very long a long history. And so I think what I want us to do now is for each of you to teach us something about that kind of long history of resistance, right? A moment, a campaign, a person that you want people to make sure they go home and learn more about in that long history. And Carl, let's start with you.
I knew it was going to be me. I knew it.
Oh, well.
No, no, I think, you know, there was a lot going on this summer, and even on this day, right? On this day, 2014, the grand jury acquitted the officers involved in Eric Garner, right? And so that's 6 years ago. We can think about the uprisings, especially New York City specific, right? That came out of that particular moment. You know, and now obviously living in Atlanta, there were moments this summer that were eerily reminiscent, at least historically speaking, of like 1943 Harlem, right? And I know there was countless articles that came out about finding that moment of comparison or that point of comparison for many historians. And a lot of people were pointing to the 60s. But what stood out to me about 43 and the uprising in Harlem that we really see is that, you know, New York City was in a different kind of place, right? It was seen as sort of this like somewhat progressive leadership. LaGuardia had patched things up after the 35 uprising. Things were kind of on the up and up. And then we have this moment again. But the resistance on the ground to me looked eerily similar to, again, what I saw here in Atlanta, thinking about how we've been framing leadership, political leadership, especially in the city, right? It's also a city that's designated as one with, uber progressive leadership. We have a Black mayor, we have, like there's a lot going on, right? So there were moments in which I kept seeing these kind of comparisons of sort of like what LaGuardia was doing, how LaGuardia was kind of positioning himself within Black leadership, of thinking about like, look, like don't go against the cops in the street in 43 in the same way that I think, Keisha Lansbottom was doing here in 2020 about like, really trying to, show that, we mean well, while still just flat out ignoring the demands of the protesters and the activists and the organizers in the streets, right? I'm sure something during Q&A is going to come up around defunding, so I don't want to, spend that time necessarily here about thinking of it as, the slogan, what have you. But one of the things that came out of that 43 uprising was there was a citizens group that demanded, well, part of the demands, they put forth like this 10-point platform, and part of the demands was actually thinking about how to make Harlem, a non-food desert. Right. And so when we think about kind of defunding conversations as sort of refunding communities and reallocating resources, right, so much of what we saw even in 1943 echoed in 2020 in ways that I think, we ought to continue to look to the past for, right, and think about kind of these lessons, again, from relatively unknown organizations. Beyond that, I hope that the book also offers context surrounding just the debates around youth, race, and crime in the United States in the 21st century. We have economists like Derek Hamilton who reminds us or puts out studies that say that race trumps class when it comes to incarceration of young people. We have psychologists like Phil Goff who have published reports that demonstrate that Black boys are seen as older and less innocent than their white counterparts. And now, for what it's worth, we have young people telling us themselves, right, in various means, that they have a different kind of relationship to carceral authorities in the United States. And too many of us remain surprised by the disparities when we learned them in 2020. And I think, for us to understand these contemporary moments, it's important for us to realize that this comes from a long history of policies and strategies that really targeted these communities.
Thank you. Garrett, how about you go next? A moment,
Okay.
campaign?
Now I'm all thrown off because you're just going,
yeah.
Anyone's fair game. Yeah, I mean, I think to me, this was just such an illustrative moment in the research and in the book. Basically, incarcerated Muslims by the late 50s and early 60s had become, in the eyes of prison officials, a major problem, in part because they were suing wardens, they were suing state commissioners, and eventually the governor. And they were organizing alongside that prison litigation. And what wound up happening in the early 60s at Attica, so this is a decade before the Attica uprising that many people are familiar with, they did a takeover of solitary confinement. And by that, essentially what they understood was that solitary was being used as a mechanism to separate their organizing, to disrupt their ability to file writs. And they essentially said, well, we're just going to purposefully commit infractions until solitary is filled with politicized, radicalized Muslim prisoners. And that this is how we undermine the mechanism of control. Because then the warden has to decide, well, do I want everyone in solitary to be politicizing, everyone else and organizing? And they're not able to punish people for other things that are unrelated to that. And what I talk about in the book is how this is coinciding exactly with jail no bail. And we understand jail no bail in the sort of civil rights history as this important moment in Albany and elsewhere about understanding how the jails are functioning. And yet we have no story about how this is happening at Attica, of all places. So I tell that story because I think it's important about who we see as kind of legible activists and activism. And also to say that, when Attica, is organized in 1971, like you have 1,000 people taking over a yard with explicit demands, that doesn't happen out of nowhere. It's because this organizing has been going on for decades. So the things that we often see as sort of the moment where it's all coming together, we don't see all the hard, painstaking labor and organizing that provides the groundwork for that. So I just think that's one of these moments where we're able to see, that this, again, to this issue of timeliness, people in the mid-century Black freedom movement were definitely thinking about prisons and definitely thinking about the punishment system. And it was the people who were receiving the brunt of that who were doing that organizing. And it's really just where we put our focus, whether or not we recognize how central that was.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And we're going to I want to follow up on this because I want us to kind of think a little bit more about how this really reshapes how we think about the Black freedom struggle. But first, Kelly, how about a story or a person, a campaign?
Yeah, I would love to tell you a story from Los Angeles. And of course, we have such an extraordinary local here. So shout out to Melina Abdullah and Patrice Cullors and Pete White and Don Jefferson and so many folks here doing the work today. I want to tell the story that I tell in City of Inmates about the first recorded killing of a young Black male by the LAPD and the extraordinary community response that has been unbroken to this day. So in April of 1927, the LAPD on a liquor charge barged into a home in South Central and shot and killed a young man by the name of Samuel Faulkner. Immediately, the community organized, responded to this cold-blooded killing. standing outside of the home while the investigation was happening, monitoring what was going on, listening to the cries of Samuel's mother, holding her up. As the days go on, the community marches to the local police station and insists upon an investigation. The insisting is so strong and so persistent and so indomitable that it actually forces the Los Angeles District Attorney to file murder charges against the police officer who killed young Samuel Faulkner. This is murder charges against the LAPD officer for killing a young Black man in 1927 to speak to the power of the community organizing that forced this case to the fore. They watch and they monitor the case that goes through the court system. They're there every day. They're on the streets. They're watching. They're reporting on it. The man who killed young Samuel Faulkner is found not guilty, and the organizing continues. The community actually occupies the police station in South Central. The Newton station, armed occupies. They go down to the police station armed and occupy the police station, forcing more investigations into that killing, but the other killings that are happening in the community. They get no response to that. They continue to organize all the way up through the We Charge Genocide campaign and organize testimony and collection of evidence about what is happening around policing and criminalization and killing in South Central. Right up to the moment that we're leading into the Watts Uprising of 1965, the Black community of Los Angeles is daily investigating the killings that are happening, the large numbers of young Black men in particular who are being killed by being shot in the back by the LAPD. And it's the explosion, the eruption that happens in 1965 that is a response to housing conditions, education, to the food desert that Carl is speaking about, but absolutely to the violence and the brutality of policing and criminalization and incarceration in the city. That really is the flashpoint of it all. And so that's the long history, sort of the origin story of Black organizing around the criminal justice system here in Los Angeles that's been unbroken to this day. And one thing I want to lift up here is that in the early years, in the response to the Sam Faulkner killing, one of the calls was for the diversification of the LAPD police force. The idea was that we needed more Black cops to solve this issue. That's quite a remarkable call that was made, especially because the cops who killed Sam Faulkner were Black. LAPD was one of the most diverse police forces in the country in the 1920s and 1930s. So community, it took a second, but by the time we move into the 40s, the 50s and 60s, the call is shifting away from diversification and reform and into what we're now talking about today as defund.
Right. Thank you. So where I want to go next is to kind of, how does this history help us rethink the Black freedom struggle, change the way we see it? I know my own work, right, around Rosa Parks, like when we see Rosa Parks doing criminal justice work her whole entire life, right? I think that changes. You know, I think this is the 65th anniversary of her bus stand, of the Montgomery bus boycott. There's all sorts of things happening this weekend, right? When we think about the Montgomery bus boycott also as a response to the fact that Emmett Till's killers had been recently acquitted and she'd been at a mass meeting 4 days earlier, that changes kind of the origin story. And so I guess my question to each of you is in some ways, how does this help us reshape how we think about the Black freedom struggle, right? What changes when we see this history? And Garrett, I want to start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think our impulse as historians is often to think about, when we think about the contemporary implications of our work, is to kind of think about this linear history of, you know, what happened then, how has it changed over time, how can that help us now? And in some ways, I think it's the most helpful when it's something that's more, and this is cumulative through studying all of our work and others, is that you understand something more fundamental about how these institutions work or how organizing works or social change. I think that's what's really helpful for me. So my impulse when kind of setting out to write this book was to think about including the Nation of Islam's organizing more centrally within the Black freedom struggle. But I think it's that moment where you kind of move beyond just thinking about comprehensiveness, or that we're pushing back where we think of the beginnings of types of organizing, to thinking about how do we ask better questions in our own movements today? How do we ask better questions based on what we know about history? So for me, I guess in my own work and in this book in particular, it's about thinking about coalitions, like the fact that the Nation of Islam was involved in local coalitions against police brutality in places like LA, around the Stokes case in 62, 63. So, and where those break. So those coalitions came together, and then they broke around issues of Islamophobia, within the Black Christian community in LA, around issues of, do we want to talk about diversity trainings, and human relations and sort of reform measures. So I think that's where it can be helpful, is actually understanding the centrality of the carceral, and by that meaning much beyond just policing prisons, but like how states are built on coercion, domination, punishment. That's helpful, because once you start to see it over centuries, then it's not just about tracing back a particular thing. It's about understanding it in a much more fundamental way that allows you to get to the root cause, instead of thinking about this kind of reformist tinkering that we often fall into.
Right. Kelly, do you want to pick up where we left off?
Sure, I'd be happy to. This is such an important question. I'm not sure I can fully answer right now, but I'm going to give it my best shot. What I do in City of Inmates is I track the rise of mass incarceration through a conceptual tool called settler colonialism. And for folks who are unfamiliar with that concept, what settler colonialism is the notion that the United States and other Anglophone colonies, right, were formed through a particular form of colonization that was not about necessarily or exclusively labor extraction, but rather was about land, grabbing access to land, removing an indigenous population, and then building up a white settler heteronormative community in that cleared land. So a settler society is predicated upon native elimination, but it's also predicated upon the elimination of all non-white queer outsiders to that white settler community. And what I do in that book is I track how the settler thrust toward elimination, toward banishment, to exclusion, tracks through a variety of communities and a variety of tactics and tools over time, targeting first indigenous populations, but also non-white immigrants, namely Chinese and Mexicans, queer white folks, and Latinx folks, and of course, Black folks. Why I think this interpretation is so important to the Black freedom struggle, right, is that it lifts up one of the other dynamics that we're fighting against in this country. That yes, it is about labor extraction, right? And it is about racial capitalism, absolutely. We are also fighting a genocide, right? So as Malcolm told us, they didn't bring us here to be citizens, right? And we got to really grapple with the fact that there is no long-term plan for Black life in this white settler society. And so it's that dimension that it really took a journey through radical Indigenous studies for me to fully kind of grapple with the eliminatory tendencies of a white settler state and its impact upon Black life, for me to understand what is the end game of all of this brutality? What is the end game of all this human caging? And that is a finding for me that shook my soul. That growing up in the Black radical tradition, I had a sort of a close relationship with racial capitalism, a close, intimate understanding. But when radical Indigenous scholars pushed me to understand another dynamic that's at work in this settler society and said, you got to look and talk seriously about genocide, that was something that was new for me personally, perhaps not for other folks here. But writing that book here in Los Angeles, where we're watching the disappearance of our local Black community, the banishment of Black folks that is happening on a daily basis through housing policy and through criminal justice and more, it is something that really hit home for me as an important dynamic of the Black freedom struggle.
Right. Thank you. And Carl?
Yeah, so going last is tough, Garrett. I agree, because you sent me in one direction and then Kelly sent me somewhere else just now, and I was like trying to take a note as to where I was going to go. I think it's imperative for movements against, what we call the carceral state, or movements that are existing, within the Black freedom struggle, more broadly, is to demand what they want and to convey what they believe is required to fight it, right? I think about, and this can come from various factions, right? That there's sort of like a role for different people to play in different spaces. I think a lot about, there was a group in Harlem, right? The Harlem Young Citizens Council in the 1950s, that we see an outgrowth of like the Harlem Mothers Conference Against Juvenile Delinquency. I write about the Harlem Six in the last chapter of the book, and we see their Mothers Defense Committee organized to, put efforts together on the ground to get their sons released. And we see inklings of that today, right? Like, I remember, what was it, 2014, when Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, and Eric Garner's mothers kind of came together. And so, so for me, I think it's important that, even with, even when we think about sort of like the broader narrative, that there's a space for different people, because, to quote Ruth Wilson Gilmore, it's going to be important for us to change everything. Right? This isn't a fight against one thing, right? Or this isn't necessarily a fight for one thing. I write a lot about sports, and I've been incredibly critical about like the NBA's like vote campaign, because it's like, vote for who, right? Like, you're not, telling us anything, tell us more, in ways that the WNBA, thinking about what's going on here in Atlanta, came out against Kelly Loeffler and was like, no, go vote for Warnock. Right. And thinking about the position that athletes can play as potential organizers and activists, and using their platforms in different kinds of ways. Right. And that's not to take away from organizers and activists on the ground, but that's to acknowledge that, there are different people who have different platforms that can use different spaces. And I think when we step back and look at history in ways to realize that there have always been those factions, right? That there have always been different people in different spaces utilizing platforms in different ways. It helps us. It helps us kind of make sense over, what oftentimes can be seen as, a lot of infighting, right? On, what the end goal is, or what the end goal should be.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I just want to remind everybody to drop questions in the chat. We're actually going to move to audience questions soon. So now is the time, put them in there. We usually don't get to all of them, but the sooner we see them, the sooner we can try to get them addressed. I want to ask a question about what you were just raising, what actually all three of you were raising, but Garrett, your phrase, reformist tinkering, sticks in my head. Speaking of reformist tinkering, the ideas of abolition have achieved a certain prominence lately. And frankly, ideas of settler colonialism, ideas about moving beyond reform and trying to get at these deeper root causes, or root explanations for the structures that we're in. And certainly there's something about the carceral state and police brutality that speaks to kind of impossibility of reform because of the nature of those institutions themselves. So how do you understand those ideas? Can you say more about ideas like abolition? How do you explain them in the present in light of the history that you talk about? Let's start. All right, let's start with Garrett.
Yeah, I'll just take one piece of this because I'm sure all three of us still won't get to all of abolition in this question. I think even the way that you talked about reform gets at part of the way that sort of the public thinks about reform, which is that reform is sort of again like this linear step, that we take small reform after small reform, and that abolition is just a degree of something, that abolition is the sort of immediate thing or the utopian thing, and that reform is the smaller thing, when it's not that. It's that reform is the fundamental premise of the system. What Angela Davis pointed out 15, 20 years ago, that the prison is a reform, that this whole system is a series of reforms, and that each reform actually deepens the violence. It expands the violence. It builds up the budgets. We've seen this, right? From the history that Carl's laying out, is each time there's a moment of uprising, there's a reform that expands the system and gives more money to it, which is why defund is a succinct way at this moment to say, no, we just want to strip the power of the system. So I think that, to me, when I first talk to people who are coming to abolition versus reform as a debate, is where I start with them. It's not that you're choosing a sort of expediency versus a long-term goal. It's that we're talking about getting at the actual problem of harm. And if we care about harm, then we have to care about the criminal legal system, which is one of the chief sort of ways that the state enacts harm upon its citizens and non-citizens. So I think that's crucial to understand, is that we're not talking about a little now, a lot later. It's about actually dealing with the problem of harm and state violence, or not dealing with it and expanding and deepening it.
Thank you. Carl.
Yeah, I think the fact that defunding and divestment and abolition have become mainstream topics of conversation is no small feat, right? That we can't overlook. It's thanks to the generations of activists and organizers who've been fighting this fight for decades. When we think about the growing number of school boards voting to terminate contracts with local police departments, that's certainly a step in the right direction. And contrary to those who believe that abolition leads to chaos, anybody who's studied abolition will tell you that abolition is about creating the world that we all want to live in, right? That's sort of the mantra. And so, I think a lot about, and, Kelly mentioned it briefly in her remarks, I talk about it in my book, right? Like, calls to diversify police departments are over 100 years old, right? Those aren't new reforms at this point. Community policing is not a new reform. If we think about New York City, right, the Samuel Battle joins the force in 1911. If we look at Black police appointments, even in southern cities, I think the last southern city, major cities like Jackson, Mississippi in 1963, right? And so, this idea that if we have more police officers that look like us, we'd have less issues, it just doesn't bear any weight when you study the police, right? And, and this should point us to what folks like, Keonga Taylor remind us, that when you put Black folks, when you put Black faces in high places and problems don't change, that's actually, emblematic that it's a systemic issue, right? That if there's something wrong with the system, that you're not going to be able to fix this, right? That this isn't a means of bad apple. And so I think it's important for us to, be able to continue that conversation and continue to encourage people to think beyond just sort of like, what you say, the reformist tinkering, right? And point them to, we've seen this tinkering for so long. Yeah.
Thank you. Kelly.
Yeah, thank you to Garrett and Carl for both of those explorations of abolition. For me, in addition to what they have said, the criminal legal system and the immigration regime are the guardians of white supremacy. And there is no reforming white supremacy. There is only abolition. And so we've got plenty of history. Carl and Garrett just laid it out, that reform has been tried, that the prison system is a reform in and of itself, and it's fundamentally flawed, it's fundamentally corrupt, it is fundamentally a practice of white supremacy that's operating at the nice edge of the state, right, with the monopoly on violence. So for me, history only provides us the evidence that abolition is the only option that we have ahead of us. To me, what that means is, yes, defund, but just as importantly, it means fund, right? Where do we need to invest the systems and practices that we need to grow, that we need to build, that we need to invest in to make sure that we all can thrive as individuals, as families, and as communities. Now, we're at a very dangerous moment, right? Simply moving funds into an educational system that is also strangled by white supremacy is not going to be the answer. Moving funds into a public health system, which clearly being evidenced to us today is also beset by white supremacy, is not going to be enough. We're really going to have to do, I think, three things: divest, invest, and redress. So the conversations that are happening across the country about a deep dive, a deep dig, and someone had mentioned Derek Hamilton's work, which is so important here in terms of addressing what you might want to call the racial wealth gap, you might call it other things. We're going to have a very serious conversation, one across the country, but certainly across the American empire as well, about how we got to these crises so we can uproot the white supremacist basis of all of this, because just shifting funds around in a white supremacist society isn't going to do it. We need a much deeper conversation. It's not going to happen with one policy. It's not going to happen with one law or one trick. It took us centuries to get here. It's going to take a while to get out, but we need sort of that bold vision, that full commitment that we are moving toward justice, and we're going to make it happen. That's what defund is all about. That's what abolition is about. That the reformist tinkering, as Garrett has put it out, we're not satisfied with that. We never have been, never will be, and we're going to push much deeper at this moment. To me, that's what abolition is.
Fabulous. Thank you. I'm going to try to, we have a lot of questions. I'm going to try to group some of them together. Forgive me for reading several at once, but I actually just looking at them, I think that might be the best way. Like maybe I'll read just several and then let each of you address them as it makes sense to you, if that's okay. Let me just read a few. This is from Victoria. What differences are you seeing in the organizing/resistance and the outside support that they garnered in women's prisons versus men's prisons during the times that you're looking at? Millicent also asks, could you talk a bit more about radicalization in prison, organizing between inside and outside, and how such traditions of resistance have transformed, maintained, etc. Emma asks, relatedly, how can we go beyond the conversation of policing as only perpetrated by police and law enforcement? The carceral punitive system is a death by 1,000 cuts lived experience of BIPOC and disenfranchised bodies, substance users, the homeless, teenagers, et cetera, that starts in places like schools, libraries, and doctors' offices. Carl, can we start with you?
And obviously I'm new to Zoom, so that's why I was muted when I started. I'll take part of Emma's question because, again, one of those moments of where I showed up to a graduate class and one of the students reminded me, they were just like, you know, none of your book actually takes place in a prison. And it was actually kind of a stark reminder because that wasn't deliberate, right? Like that wasn't on purpose, right? I didn't seek out a book that didn't exist in a prison space. But yet it's a book that fits in conversations with prisons, right? And so I think it speaks to Emma's question a bit, especially about policing and understanding the policing apparatus. That is something that's much more encompassing than just the prison walls, right? You know, and so something that I often encourage students to do in classrooms, and I'm always kind of thinking about myself, is to separate policing the verb, right, and police the noun. that we can identify who the police are at most points, but that doesn't necessarily mean when the boys in blue or the badges aren't present that there isn't policing happening in some way, shape, or form. And so I think something that I talked about earlier with stuff like the media, but also something that I've really been diving into lately, and it's where this next project is going, is also in sports, right? And organized sport as a mean of crime deterrent. It's something that I've been doing a deep dive in. It's part of the next book project. And just thinking about what does it mean when we look back at how sport as an entity has been used in primarily Black and brown communities through organizations like police athletic leagues, like the Amateur Athletic Association, like CYOs, like YMCAs, as a means of getting kids primarily, right, off the street, occupying their time in very structured manners, but also becoming incredibly invasive, right? The police athletic leagues is one of these reforms that we talk about that, on paper might mean well, but we know that increased contact with police, whether they have their uniforms on or not, is going to lead to more arrests and so there's sort of like this dynamic that also exists here. And, for me, I think there's something fundamental that all of these, sport organizations that I'm doing this dive into are also founded in the progressive era, right? And when we think about what that means historically and what that means with many of these institutions, right? And so to Emma's question about understanding kind of this policing apparatus and realizing that it is something much bigger than, that it has its kind of influence in its hands kind of everywhere, I think it's important for us to be able to identify that, right? And how do we then have that conversation, right? I expect many a pushback of being like, but look at what sport has done for me, right? And it's just like, but think about the shortcoming that it's meant for so many, right? So.
Thank you. Kelly?
Yeah, those are great questions. And I don't know if I'm going to answer any one of them in particular, but I'm going to talk about what they made me think of. And what they made me think of is how often and how much people inside prisons who have been incarcerated have changed our world in dramatic and profound ways. And I want to tell a quick story that's really coming out of the book I'm writing right now, but related to the Black freedom dream, right? So if you go back to the early 20th century, Mexico was a place that we looked to the possibility of finding land, of fighting freedom from Jim Crow. And Gerald Horne writes about this quite a bit as we head into the Mexican Revolution in particular. Well, I want to tell a story about a couple of Mexican exiles who were incarcerated here in the United States who challenged white supremacy across borders and helped to ignite the Black freedom dream for Mexico. So in about 1904, a group of Mexican radicals, writers, intellectuals, poets had been organizing against the dictator in Mexico, a man named Porfirio Diaz, who had ruled Mexico for nearly 30 years. And what tool did he use against them? Of course, was criminalization and policing and incarceration of the thugs of the state who would break up their offices. So they come to the United States to hopefully organize the outbreak of the Mexican Revolution. Well, the United States, which was greatly invested in Mexico, Rockefellers, your Dohenis, your Hearsts, all the major families, all are extracting their wealth out of Mexico, investing it here in industrial capitalism, managing laboring populations. They organize to shut down this revolution, and they work with the Department of State, the emerging US Department of Justice, and believe it or not, the FBI is established in large part in response to these Mexican exiles who are organizing the Mexican Revolution. And those early practices of COINTELPRO take root. They are formated, they're in formation in organizing and policing these Mexican exiles. So a group of Mexican immigrants known as Los Magonistas are arrested across the United States and imprisoned in an attempt to crush the outbreak of the Mexican Revolution, to crush the challenge to white supremacy across borders that they represented. And when they're incarcerated, especially here in Los Angeles and Los Angeles County Jail, they continue to organize across the barrier of the wall, their community on the outside and the community on the inside. And they're moving rebel correspondence. They're smuggling it in the laundry system. They're smuggling it by dropping out of windows, whispering to each other across the bars. And in those whispers and in that smuggled correspondence, they actually plan 2 armed raids into Mexico from the United States in 1906 and 1908 that helped to foment the final outbreak of the Mexican Revolution in 1910, which is this extraordinary, it's the first social revolution of the 20th century, this extraordinary moment in contestation with white supremacy and the settler state. And it's this moment where we as Black folks we reaffirm our thinking about moving south as a possibility for our freedom dream. So this is one example of which people on the inside have radically challenged the world in which we live for the better. And I'm sure Garrett perhaps has many more stories to share with us, but of course that continues to happen to this very moment. And actually I know, Garrett, you're very involved in some of the organizing that's currently happening across bars.
Thank you. Garrett?
Yeah, wow. Thank you, Kelly. What a setup. So I was thinking about the inside-outside question in particular, because I'm part of this program, Study and Struggle, that we were lucky enough to have Kelly as a guest for our Critical Conversation series. But it's really about political education, inside and outside, and forging relationships through pen pals and supporting grassroots movements in Mississippi. And there's this letter actually in the book that I write about where an incarcerated Muslim is writing to Malcolm X, and he uses this phrase. He says, the fighting man cannot win the war without the moral support of the home front. And that's how he sort of articulates this relationship between the war that they're fighting inside and the support needed from Malcolm and others outside. And actually the person who I was talking about earlier with the takeovers of solitary, I'm writing a biography on Martin Sostre now, and he later becomes a political prisoner. And when he gets out in 1975, he just says, I'm moving from maximum security to minimum security. And I think that's a really good theorization about the kind of inside-outside relationship that we're talking about, because as a Black anarchist, he understood that anytime, we're living under a state regime, especially, racial capitalist one, we're living within all sorts of forms of domination, of coercion, of surveillance, and punishment. So I think when we think about the importance of inside-outside organizing, it's also important to think about the relationship of inside and outside, which is that we're all just talking about degrees and forms of domination and surveillance. So I think that's, to me, where I think about this. And really, as Carl and Kelly said, people inside are organizing against state violence every single day in ways small and large, but they're always doing that in concert with people outside. So I just encourage people to get involved in similar small and large ways to support people.
Can you say again the name of the effort that you're involved in and how people can find out more about it?
Yeah, it's Study and Struggle. And you can go to our website, it's just studyandstruggle.com.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We still have a little bit of time, but there are some questions that are directly addressed to all three of you. So let me just read out like a whole bunch of them and then we'll just take them. Let's see. For Kelly, you mentioned in your books, this is from Mitch. You mentioned in your book, City of Inmates, how difficult it was to obtain official records of incarceration in Los Angeles. Do you think that this move to try to hide, eliminate, or not even create arrest records is an intentional way for the country to make research like yours not possible so that we don't talk about the issue of mass incarceration? Also for Kelly, could you speak, this is from AJ, could you speak to the economic incentives for policing to discover crimes as a way to fill prison beds with Black bodies to maintain revenues for private prison operators? Actually, do you want to address these and then I'll read some for Garrett and Carl?
Sure. Yeah, systematically across the United States, law enforcement agencies are generally not compelled to save the vast majority of their records, their administrative records that they produce. And I would argue that this is absolutely a strategy to make it difficult for the public to inquire, to monitor, to check, to investigate, whether it's in the present or historically, the work of the state in criminalizing and policing and caging our communities. So I don't think that that's an accident. Again, I don't know if it's a cabal, right, in the sense of it's an intentional cabal, but I do think it's the thrust. It's the culture of a racial capitalist white settler state. And when the police is the guardians of white supremacy, you got to guard the guardians, right? You got to hood them up. So I think that's certainly a part of the story. I know my team that I work with at UCLA, the $1 Million Hoods research team, we're doing a considerable amount of work in trying to save the historical records of the LAPD and to make sure that they are made available for our communities to investigate what has been done to whom and by whom and at what cost and what consequence. So shout out to Mark Vestal and the team members who are doing that archival work right now. And the second question, as I recall, had to do with privatization or private jails and prisons and Black bodies and profit extraction. Absolutely, right? So the long punchline of our story has been the extraction of profit from our bodies and our labor. That remains consistent to this very day and is activated on a daily basis in a multitude of ways by the criminal legal regime, whether or not it be the fine and fees system, whether or not it be compulsory voluntary work that happens for people to pay off or to get out of jail early, whether or not it's labor that's happening within our prisons, and so on and so on and so on. In addition to that, I do think that one of the things in my work in City of Inmates is that there is something that lingers beyond, between, and within that profit extraction, that profit motive, that even without it, right, or it can be shrouded in a multitude of ways, the policing, the criminalization, the locking up of Black bodies continues. So here I want to sort of lift up the work of Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, who often reminds us that only about 10% of the people who are inside are in a private facility, that the vast majority of this carceral regime is happening under municipal government, state governments, and the federal government. There is profit that's extracted there. There are jobs that are created in that, absolutely. However, I think in my work, I would also bring us back to this punchline that the state will invest a considerable amount of money to drive toward the finish line of Black disappearance from this white settler state.
Wow, thank you. Mark has a question for Garrett. Can Garrett explain why he chose the title for his book? Does his research on the NOI in prisons lead him to conclusions that differ from work done by Eric Cummins, Rise and Fall of California's Radical Prison Movement, and Dan Berger, Captive Nation?
Thank you so much for the question. So the phrase, those who know don't say, is part of, it's the second half of a phrase that was given by Muslims in the nation when they were asked about their political engagement. So they would say, those who say don't know, and those who know don't say. And I was drawn to the second half of it because it sort of encapsulated what I felt like was the driving question for me. The project is, why do we not think about the Nation of Islam as a central player in the mid-century Black freedom movement? And in part because of these sort of strategic silences by the nation. And then the first part became really essential to me, which is the sort of those who say don't know, which is the way that knowledge formation by the state in coordination with scholars and journalists perpetuates misunderstandings, misframings of Black nationalism as sort of Black supremacy. So I was really interested in the dialectical relationship between strategic silence of activists and the state sort of creating knowledge. And yeah, shout out to Dan Berger's amazing book, Captive Nation, if folks haven't read it. I think, by and large, I fall in line with sort of his interpretations of the most centrally the importance of the Black radical tradition inside.
Thank you. And Carl, Mark asks, same Mark, asks, did Carl grow up in New York City? If not, how did his work end up focusing on New York City? Did Fox Butterfield's book on Willie Bosket, All God's Children, play a big role in his research on Black youth in prisons in New York? Mark is well read. Did he come across a story, did he, meaning you, Carl, come across a story more horrific than Kalief Browder in 2010?
So the familial roots are in New York. My father was in the military, so we ended up moving a bunch, but most of my life I grew up in the Bronx, actually, right? So yes, to the answer of, New York City. I moved out of the Bronx and moved to Delaware, actually, when my sister was getting ready to start high school. And so my sister is older than me, so I had to be in like 7th or 8th grade, but New York is always considered home. That's not necessarily how I ended up focusing on New York, though, right? There was, once in a blue moon, I think about the very ambitious graduate student who was living in Indiana and wanted to do a project on New York and Los Angeles at the same time. And I remember the dissertation proposal was just that. I was going to have 2 chapters on New York. I was going to follow the Dodgers out of Brooklyn to LA, and I was going to be the narrative trope of tying what it meant for a city that was on the quote unquote decline and a city that was on the rise, and what it meant in terms of juvenile justice policies. I thought it was a brilliant project, and my advisor reminded me that I was living in Bloomington, Indiana. And so, there were very practical decisions that went into it. He then left Bloomington, Indiana to take over as the director of the Schomburg Center, which allowed me to spend ample time in New York City while dissertating, right? And so there were also very practical reasons, right? I knew I wanted to do I knew I wanted to spend time on a northern city, or, thinking about LA as a Western city, but it wasn't only for personal reasons, right? There was a moment where I thought I was going to dive into some Bronx histories, as another moment of a shout out, thinking of somebody's work like LaShawn Harris. And then I started finding my family all over it, and I thought it was weird. And so I stepped away from it. And that moment, I won't necessarily not return to it later. And so I say all that to say, I ended up focusing on New York for very practical reasons. But yes, I also did grow up in New York. I love Fox Butterfield's work. The Willie Bosket story is amazing. I didn't necessarily, lean on it for the research here on the project. And unfortunately, I think there are horrific stories like Kalief Browder that we see time and time again. I will say one of the things in the book that I tried to do with the case of the Harlem Six from 1964 in that last chapter was I was really excited to come across images of 4 of the young boys who were released that hadn't been used prior to the book. And what those images, I think, show was how young they were at their point of arrest, and then how old they were when they got out, right? And, thinking about these formidable years of their lives that just, were spent inside for no reason, other than there was a racist system in place that they found themselves kind of navigating. I will say, I do think the thing about Kalief Browder's story that really stands out is I think that Time docuseries on his story is one of the most well done, most powerfully visual, kind of tough to watch moments. And so I do think about Kalief Browder a lot. I think about the monstrosity that is Rikers Island, and I hope that we can continue to raise awareness, especially in New York City and around, of these kind of longer struggles. Yeah.
Thank you. We have just a few minutes left, and I can't help but ask, when I work with young people and talk about stories from the long Black freedom struggle, inevitably they sort of bounce back and forth between feeling inspired that people said and did these amazing things in our history and feeling validated by that history, and then feeling depressed that people articulated nearly identical demands and complaints and problems so long ago. And I don't ever want to require of them that they be hopeful. I think, we have a range of emotional responses to this and different ways of looking at the future. And that's part of their journey. I try to just help them attend to it. But I'm curious to know how you feel about where we are right now. And if you're hopeful, why you're hopeful. And if you're not, why you're not. If that's, where are you right now? Garrett.
Oh, where am I right now? I mean, I think usually I feel most responsive to the type of work I'm doing than sort of the historical moment we're in, because as we've all talked about, these are perpetual crises in a white settler state. So I think it's more about, am I doing the work the right way? Do I feel good about the people around me and the organizing we're doing? And certainly I think always hopeful in finding stories of people who were radically challenging. I mean, I find that endlessly hopeful, to find the work that people were doing so long ago, articulating. I mean, every time I find someone talking about abolition in the 19th century, of the penitentiary, when it was just like 20 years old, I find that incredibly inspiring. And I think to the point that Carl made earlier, like it's hard to not be hopeful about the conversations we're having right now, at this level, at this sort of national, international level about abolition, because people, especially after this summer, are hungry to learn about the ideas that people have been painstakingly formulating for certainly decades, if not longer, around what PIC abolition is.
Thank you, Garrett. Carl.
Yeah, I tell my students all the time I'm a hopeful realist, right? That, I am from New York, but I'm a Lakers fan. And while I have a recent history of cheering for a good team, I've also have some down years in between, right? And so these moments of sort of ebb and flow, I tend to think of like a sports person, because that's where I kind of distract myself at times when I need to get away from it. So shout out to, teams like the Jets, right? And fans that support the Jets, that know what it's like to cheer for a team every year that's going to give their best effort and potentially not win much. And so I say that semi-jokingly, but also in a space of kind of realization that, when you understand the history, you're going to kind of ebb and flow, right? You're going to kind of have these moments in which, we can see some sort of hope and some sort of promise on the horizon. But we also, because we know the history and we have hindsight, we kind of can prepare for what the potential backlash to it might look like, right? And what that is where the history does kind of come into play, in a very promising way, right? That allows us to kind of think about how to be better prepared, for the rebuttal. And I think a lot about, I think it was Ibram Kendi who wrote a piece in like the New York Times or Washington Post or something some years ago that was just like, racial progress and racist progress are running two separate races, right? And that it's not one thing to understand that these, movements are kind of happening on the same plane, but actually happening parallel to one another, right? That is, as kind of we think about this progress that we may be making, the evolution of racism is also constantly changing, right? And so we have to think of ways and look to the past to think about how to be prepared for that evolution, right? On that other side, on that, plane that's running a simultaneous race.
Thank you so much, Carl. Kelly.
So I pray on Ella Baker every day. I get up and I know where our ancestors have, the work they have done to get us here. My ancestors, my personal family, blood ancestors, and everybody else. So I am inspired by the work that has been done generation after generation after generation before us. And I am confident that I can get up every day, and everybody here can get up every day and continue the work as we move forward. Like Carl, I'm also deeply cautious of this moment that we have stood at that precipice of abolition at least twice before, right? The end of enslavement, at the end of the civil rights movement. And each time there has been the construction of a new regime of racial control. And so many of us are at the center, are working at the center of this story right now. And I very much don't want to look back 50 years from now and think that we participated in the construction of this new regime. So I'm trying to stay on my toes. I'm trying to listen very carefully. I'm trying to stay open, that we need all hands on deck. We need a multitude of methods and voices and a full movement to get us beyond the precipice and towards something that's looking like justice. So I know we can do this, right? It has been done. People have been fighting, but I'm also very cautious about the danger, the incredible danger of this moment.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Kelly, Garrett, Carl, Jean. Thank you all for joining us. Please don't forget to get copies of Those Who Know Don't Say, The Nation of Islam, the Black Freedom Movement, and the Carceral State. Get City of Inmates, Conquest, Rebellion, and the Rise of Human Caging in Los Angeles, 1771 to 1965, and Presumed Criminal, Black Youth and the Justice System in Postwar New York, all of which you can get at the Schomburg shop. Thank you to everybody who donated through Eventbrite. If you want to donate to the Schomburg Education Department, you can do so at schomburgcenter.org/support-education. Thanks again to our panelists for their brilliance and their clarity. Stay safe, everyone. Good night.